So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. We are still, of course, with our surah right there, Surah al-Maida, but I was really hoping that we can at least go farther, and I would say trying to go faster in those ayat, inshallah. So we were talking last time about the different, of course, within the ayat, the different, let's call it punishments in relationship to the different types of assaults, whether it's an assault on someone's life or whether it's an assault on someone's different body parts, different organs, and certainly whether we're speaking about the eyes, we're speaking about the nose, the ears, the teeth, and certainly the different assaults. Now, a number of things to say here in where we did mention that there were different types and where we don't necessarily say, okay, well, here it is. You did an assault on the eye, therefore we're just going to right away go ahead and do the same type of an assault. In other words, with the same level. It really depends on how far the assault went. Did it somehow cause a deformity? Did it actually cause a situation where the person is at least, not functioning well with it? So are we talking about complete, incomplete? How much of an assault or how much of a trouble and how much of a deformity or even an effect did it have? So we were talking about the different opinions between scholars on whether that actually means that the person has the right. And of course, these are the bodily injuries. Just keep in mind, bodily injuries are not hudud. Those are actually within the area of qasas. So what's the difference? So hudud would more be a transgression on the limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had set. Al-Qasas would be more relating to people's rights. So we're having an assault on different people. We're having people are the ones that determine whether they actually want a fair trial in order to basically, hey, give them, of course, the retaliation or at least their right, because they have the right to get compensation. So they can choose to get compensation, or they can choose that, no, the same assault that happened to me, I want happening on that person as an equal punishment, basically. So then that's where the scholars would actually have these differences of opinions on whether there's something called hukuma, in where the qadi himself, there isn't necessarily a specific amount or a specific, let's call it punishment of what makes a fair trial. So that's when the judge would intervene in this situation and determine, based on the evaluation for the case, based on, of course, the implication, whether we're talking about psychologically or whether we're talking about socially or perhaps financially. All those different areas are going to be taken in consideration before the judge makes a fair trial to what would be the fair compensation, or even perhaps the same, perhaps let's say a fair judgment on that assault that had happened, what would make a fair compensation for the other person. So that's where, of course, that whole, I would say, debate between scholars, how far and how do we treat and how do we deal with this, what makes a fair trial, and so forth. Now, one thing I'm sure you had all noticed is that a lot of it doesn't really depend on a hadith. We didn't have plenty of a hadith. We didn't have plenty of, let's say, textual evidence in where for it to be a reference in of course in that ruling and judging the situations. A lot of it is really dependent on what some of the scholars or some of the Sahaba or some of the Tabi'een had said, and what their take and what their note in relationship to these types of assaults and what they think would be a fair trial. And it's important to keep in mind that when we're speaking about a hadith, well, that's the end of it, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was really clear about it, in where أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول. So there's no question. We cannot go against the Prophet ﷺ. Once we have an authentic hadith, then that actually becomes the reference to be final on this matter. There's no differences of opinions. That's it. They might have differences of opinions on how we interpret it and whether this hadith is actually, let's say, equivalent to the situation and going in the same direction to what matter and what situation we're discussing at the time. But then when it goes into, of course, the level where the Prophet ﷺ made the final judgment, or had mentioned a hadith, or that we've got an ayah, of course, there's no question about that. Or if we have an ayah, that's it. That's it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا يؤمنون حتى يحكموك فيما شجر بينهم. They would not be believers unless they would put you, that is the Prophet ﷺ, whether we're speaking about hadith or whether we're speaking about the different reports that were on the Prophet ﷺ, حتى يحكموك, unless they make you be the main person to judge in between their matters. But if we don't have a hadith, and then we have the Sahabis or the different Sahaba, that they would have a report on this. So there, in terms of the Sahaba, this actually goes into two directions. There's al-mawquf and there's al-marfu'. What's the difference? So al-marfu' would be on matters that we're looking at a situation where this information, looking at the text or looking at the report, in where that piece of information that was stated about from the Sahabi and through the Sahabi, if it sounds, or if it basically would give us that this was not something that was basically coming from their opinion or their own selves, but it was actually coming from an inspiration coming from the Prophet ﷺ, then that would be in the status of al-marfu'. In other words, it's not their own selves, it's not their own opinion. But if we're talking about their own take on this, this would be mawquf. Now, here's the thing. Within this area, can we judge this as, let's say, a report, a certain report? Can we judge it that this is mawquf, marfu'? You will have differences of opinions between scholars debating on whether this does go into the level of marfu' or whether this is mawquf. So things that are, let's say, information about the past, information about certain things about the ayat, in where it's basically giving me some form of exegesis, some form of interpretation. In that situation, we would know that the Sahabi is not putting their own opinion, but they're actually taking it as coming from the Prophet ﷺ, and this really is inspired by the Prophet ﷺ. So there's no way that they can make up some information, and we're not talking about if it's not accurate, that's a different story, but we're talking about what acts in a place of marfu', what actually takes the category of marfu' if we're having a Sahabi say something. So that would be in situations where it could be an informative clause, and where it's talking about, let's say, things in history, things that there's no way that the Sahabi can somehow, think that he's putting this information from his own head, but he's trying to basically report it as if it's coming from the Prophet. So that's just a different situation. Il-Mawquf, on the other hand, when we're speaking about the reports of the Sahaba, they can be authentic and they can be not authentic. Okay, so this is important. The athar, it's called an athar. Okay, let's write that down, right? Let's write that down so we can actually have these reports right there and kind of help us understand what we're talking about. So we were talking about, number one, we were talking about qawl al-sahabi. Okay, number two, we said that there's the marfu' and there is the mawquf. Okay, and we said marfu' would be that they were attributing it to the Prophet ﷺ. Basically, mawquf would be their own opinion. And it's important to keep in mind that these athar, they're called athar because the word hadith is actually relating to the Prophet ﷺ. Okay? So a certain quote that is basically attributed to the Prophet ﷺ, that's a hadith. Al-athar, a certain quote that's attributed to the Sahabi. The athar and the most important books and references to go for, let's say, the collection of al-athar are basically two books, Musannaf ibn Abi Shayba. Okay, it's a huge book. And the second one is Musannaf ibn Abd al-Razzaq. Those are actually the most important, let's call them collections, let's call them books that basically had compiled the different resources in regards to the athar, and therefore, it's important to just know where are these reports and where are they compiled? Where would we find them? And certainly, just realize these two, and they would actually have التحقيق. التحقيق, which basically would have the scholars. You remember when we talked about المحققين, we said Shu'aib al-Arnaout, we talked about Abu Ghudda, we talked about, a number of different muhaqqiqin, and where they would go over these reports and study them, and they would have their note at the bottom. So this is extremely important. So if you want to right now go to any of these books, most of them have actually been through a lot of good and magnificent tahqiq, in where it makes it easy for us to not necessarily go over these reports, because some other scholars had already done the jobs for us, and you would find it in the footnote where they would say, well, this is authentic, this is not authentic, and the list goes on and on. Okay. So this is just to understand qawl al-sahabi. Would we necessarily take, just because a sahabi had said something, would we necessarily just take it and say, well, here's the note for a sahabi, and therefore we're just going to accept it as basically the reference? So that definitely, that would be an inspiration, but then it has to go through, again, that research to check whether it's authentic or not. What if it's authentic? If it's authentic, then that definitely would be an important reference an important note of reference to consider one opinion more preponderant or preponderant over the other. If it is not authentic, then in that situation, we wouldn't necessarily take it as a reference, but it can be an inspiration depending on what we're talking about. Okay, then if we don't have an authentic reference to basically determine or make one opinion preponderant, or one opinion, let's say, weighing more in terms of evidence over the other, then in that situation, we would see what other scholars had said and what their take on this was. And then we would start comparing the notes, making sure, of course, we're not bringing in. So the question is, why are we even concerned about what scholars said? Why not just make our own new opinion, our own new interpretation, and just go on? Hey, they started something. Why can't we start something new? So two things for this. Number one is that it's important to actually go back to the scholars, because the other scholars had reviewed this opinion, and you don't want to start something new without you realizing, because when you start something new, it can carry a lot of, let's say, a lot of lack of revision, let's say it that way, where it's not reviewed. But what was already mentioned by scholars, you would see other scholars had reviewed it, and then they had mentioned that it was considerable opinion, in where, one, it goes in a parallel with the different resources, with the different textual evidences. Two, it goes in parallel with maqasid al-Shariah, with the different legal maxims. And certainly you would see number three, in where it's going with in parallel with even what the other scholars had approved. So that's why it's important to take an opinion, an interpretation that was already mentioned, to make sure you're not going within the area of your own self-manipulation. So this is extremely important because you could easily self-manipulate yourself and think that you're doing something that goes in congruence and that it goes in parallel with Islam without you realizing you're actually just self-manipulating yourself. So that's why it's important to really review what the other Salihin, the other scholars had said to make sure that we are getting that inspiration from the scholars that had better knowledge, and certainly their research had surpassed our knowledge and surpassed our research by far. It's important to mention, this is, a question that someone might ask. Isn't our knowledge right now, let's say somebody has a PhD in Shariah, or somebody has 2 or 3 PhDs or whatever, does that knowledge, or is that knowledge equivalent to the ilm of those scholars at the time? The answer is absolutely not. PhDs today during our time, I would say they are what is the word that I could use, but they are really at an elementary level compared to their ilm at the time. This is important to keep in mind. If PhDs are at the elementary level compared to their ilm at the time, how is it with someone that doesn't even have any Islamic studies degree whatsoever compared to that? Okay, just want you to put that into account. Okay, how do we know that that's what level that is? I want you to keep in mind, these scholars were memorizing the Quran at age 9. The whole Quran, it's already memorized. Qira'at al-ashr, oh, that was a piece of cake. By age 12, they're all done. Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, that was already memorized by age 12 and 13. الكتب الستة, the different books, Sunan al-Nasa'i, Sunan Ibn Majah, etc. Those are all memorized by age 14. Already they're all done with it. You're talking about the books of usul, the books of fiqh, all of those were already mastered by the age of 14 and 15. So, and you see today's PhD, in where today's PhD, okay, they have a PhD, but they didn't even complete, let's say, the 7, 8, and 9-year-old level at the time, where they had memorized the Quran, where they had memorized the Qira'at al-Ashr, where they had memorized al-Kutub al-Sahihain, al-Kutub al-Sitta, and all those books of ahadith, and they had already went farther in that level. So in other words, when you look at the 14 and 15-year-old back then, really at a level that is way beyond 4 and 5 and 6 PhDs, we're looking at the disgrace that we're living in. And we're unfortunately, we're not realizing the amount of ilm that they actually had at the time. They were spending not only their focus and not only their energy, but they had went beyond in their hifz and even in their understanding. So we're not just talking about hifz. Okay, hifz is one piece, but even when it comes to understanding their Lugha Arabiya was key to understanding the different books and understanding the different sciences. So their Lugha Arabiya even went beyond our Lugha Arabiya, and their poetry actually says it. It reflects their amount of knowledge in the Arabic language, which is considered as ulum al-ala. It's considered those, let's call it the key to understanding those sciences. So if they had surpassed us by all of these, for us to claim that we somehow have the ability to go farther in our understanding / interpretation to the different, of course, texts, and claim that, hey, we can bring about a new interpretation because I have a PhD and all of that, and not realize that your ilm is not even at a 14-year-old level at their time. It would be a disgrace to actually not realize that within this perspective, that Hey, be humble. And during our times, unfortunately, such degrees are really nothing but a social status and not really reflecting the true ilm of what it actually carries. That's extremely sad. So we really have a lot to work on. We really have a lot to, I guess, relate to in terms of ilm and even humility and be humble and even understand that
But we keep going, right?
we keep going, Nora. We keep going. I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing anything. I mean, I would be the first one to stop at teaching because I would recognize that I'm way farther than that level. But I'm not stopping. I'm just saying, Ya Rabbi, this is what I could do. This is what we're capable of doing. This is what we are trying to bring about, I guess, this saqf, trying to elevate, I guess, our situation, our status, and we're going to be putting in, I was just talking to Sister Umayya and I said, you've got to start teaching. Even though the situation is that we recognize that we still have a lot to work on in terms of seeking ilm, but we don't stop. We know that we have a lot to work on, but we don't stop. And you want to keep in mind that every single era, every single time in history actually needs a different set of work. What do I mean by that? We would see in where conferences right now. Okay, the conferences right now, they don't necessarily give you ilm per se, but they really give an input. I'm talking about the conferences like, ISNA conference, ICNA, whatever, Mass ICNA, whatever it is. They don't really have ilm, but it's actually a good time sometimes to give that emotional support, I guess, in where it's connecting the Muslims together. It's actually good to attend these things. I'm not against it whatsoever. All right. But certainly I'm against, inviting people that are not specialized and introducing them as, as specialists, but that's a different story. But a true alim recognizes that, or a true talib ilm recognizes that the areas that we really need to invest in are those that would empower the society, empower the Muslims through ilm. That's extremely important. So when we just see in where there's the emotional support, but there's the mental foundation, there's the educational foundation, because that actually keeps us grounded. Okay, so we don't stop if we're not at the level of those ulama at that time. We keep going because this is situation that we're living in. It basically has different levels, different degrees, let's call it standards. Yesterday, a sister was telling me, hey, they're sending this fatwa in where I think it's like a necklace that has these little star things, these leaf clover leaf thing. And she was wondering, why would they give a fatwa that it's haram? Shouldn't we necessarily recognize that the situation around us is that people are struggling with their tawheed? Why even be concerned about, this four-leaf clover, whatever it why even tell the girls not to buy it? And there are more important things. And I said, well, listen, you know, we have to understand that that they actually come from a considerable opinion, even if I may not consider that that's an important, or at least a good takhrij, or a good view or place of vision in how we could understand whether this is important or not. But the whole thing in where to think that, oh, well, we've got some important things by giving such fatwa, we're getting the people repel away from the religion. We have to consider that. I was like, well, wait a minute. If we're going to keep on lowering the standards of what Muslims consider as a priority and what Muslims consider as basically important in the deen, if we're going to keep on lowering the standards, then without us realizing what we're really setting as a paradigm that we are trying to get to somehow lay out as a standard is really the paradigm and the adaptation to the kuffar. If we're considering that they're the standard that we're trying to get to, or that the Muslims we're at least trying to get them just slightly above the kuffar standard, we're really in big trouble here. We're really in big trouble, because what we're supposed to be trying to do is alleviate the Muslim standards and not necessarily consider, when you look at how do you go up with the standard, there's always a point that you would consider as your at least place of access. Okay, if our place of access is the kuffar, and where every single time we're going up, let's say a couple degrees, we're going to somehow, I guess, appreciate and somehow just go up a little bit and say, hey, that's all we're going to be doing. We're not going to go up a level. No, your point of access is not the kuffar. Your point of access is the mu'mineen, is the salihin. So your point of access, you're trying to go based on that point of access, the salihin, and you're trying to match their level of salah. Not looking at the point of access of the kuffar, and I'm trying to barely go up a little bit and considering myself, hey, you did a good job because I went up a degree or two beyond the kuffar, or a degree or two beyond the munafiqeen. No, your point of access, you're trying to match the mu'mineen, the salihin. You're trying to match them up there. And this is extremely important, speaking of that, and where to think that, oh, we shouldn't be giving these fatawa and making the girls feel that, hey, are we banning nail polish, halal nail polish, so-called? And if we're going to keep on doing these things, then we're basically letting the girls feel that they can't be good Muslims, and therefore it's too hard. Therefore, we have to make our fatawa easier for people to adapt to. If you're making the fatawa easier, then your consideration is not necessarily how to get to the text guiding us, but you're getting that, let's call it, that zone and that access in where, how do we consider that we're supposed to adapt within the society? It's the text that guides us, and not the people that direct our fatwa. It's not the people that direct the fatwa. It's that we bend down. We simply would submit ourselves to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not submit ourselves to the people and what they want the fatwa or the paradigm to look like. This is extremely important. So how did I get there, Noda? I don't know how I went from, oh yeah, I was actually talking about qawl al-sahabi. So when we're speaking about aqwal al-ulama, it's important to keep in mind that it is huda wa nur. It's basically huda, it's basically the guidance, and that's the level for all mankind in where they're seeking guidance. But nur is going to be more specific to a certain group of people. When you look at whether, let's go a little bit farther right there, and where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually talked about Prophet Isa alayhi salam, and where he said, "Ataynahu al-Injil, fihi huda wa nur," and where in al-Injil there is huda. What is al-huda, and why huda and nur? Is this the letter wa right there? Is this mughayara? Is this to talk about something that is different, or is this to talk about an addition? Or is this to talk about specification? So il-huda would more be general, in where it's guidance for all people. And in nur would be specific, in where only a small group of people would be digging deeper in where they're capable of finding, let's say, a more specific, a higher level of light. Because guidance, say, all these people are finding, all the Muslims are finding guidance in Islam, all the Muslims, they're basically adhering to the religion of Islam. But only a specific and a small group of people are going deeper in that level and really finding the light. Just keep that in mind. In where are we here just considering the general, or let's say an elementary level of Islam, or do we want to go at a higher level and don't want an elementary level? We're actually trying to go a higher level in where that level of Islam at the level of Iman. And is somebody else going probably even farther in where it's the nur, from the nur in the heart to the nur in ruh. There's a difference between the nur and the light in the mind slash the light in our, remember, shahadat Allah ilaha illallah, the light in our vision, in understanding, of course, let's call it the minimum, in where the understanding and where you're recognizing that as your resource, but then there's a nur in the heart, and that's the level of an iman. A level of an iman is basically where no, they had gone farther. There's no way that a person can have the light go into their heart unless their heart went and underwent through a lot of different stations in training. And what we mean by training in their focus, in where they're willing to give up. And this is extremely important. There's no way that you can grow in your iman unless you went through a form of takhliyah and tazkiyah. Let's write that one down. There's no way that you can grow in your deen unless you went into some form of takhliyah. Let's write that down. And tazkiyah, what's the difference? So takhliyah is a situation in where you let go of different things. You basically had, let's call it, remove the contaminations. You have to set certain boundaries, and where you're letting go of a lot of the different friends, a lot of the different, probably, let's call them spiritual denouncers. And when you let go of these things, it isn't until you change your lifestyle. And we're not talking about adding things, but you're not going to be capable of adding, let's say, an ability to memorize the Quran unless you let go of a lot of those different distractions. Let go of those distractions, let go of those different things that are keeping your focus away, and you're going to find yourself finding the time, you're going to find yourself finding the energy, you're going to see that you're regaining your ability to focus in order to be able to get into tazkiyah. Tazkiyah is purification. You don't do the purification before you remove the contamination. Think of it as you're washing your hands. You first have to remove whatever is off your hands, for example, and then you're going to go stage 2 after removing whatever the contamination is there. Then you're taking then into the second stage in where you're sanitizing, you're, I guess, making your hands go into another stage, in where after removing all the different contaminations, then you're going into now a higher stage of purification. Now you're probably making them smell better. You're probably, hey, you're removing each and every single bit. That contamination removal in itself, by default, by definition, it actually contains within it the tazkiyah. So it-takhliyah brings in the tazkiyah. This is important to keep in mind. So when we speak about these stations, we're speaking about that nur in the heart. The nur in the heart actually comes when the person had done a lot of takhliyah. They had left a lot of contaminations, whether we're speaking about visual contaminations, what they're looking at, or what they're listening to, or the groups that they're hanging out with, or the lifestyle that they're living, or perhaps the clothes that they're wearing. They're just giving up on a lot of different things. Once they give up on a lot of things, they're going to slightly start seeing the change within their ability to focus. That's where a nur, where the Prophet ﷺ, he basically mentioned that nur, or the iman, ما وقر في القلب وصدقه العمل. So the The real iman is basically what was engraved in the heart, and you would see that the actions are going to come confirming what was already instilled in the heart. In other words, if you want to ask someone about, well, how deep is their iman, you need to ask yourself, were you capable of doing 1, 2, 3, 4? If you weren't capable of doing 1, 2, 3, 4, that means that iman was still at an elementary level, and therefore you need to work on your iman. You need to work on removing more contaminations. In other words, you're putting in some contaminations that are weakening you from going into tazkiyah. So I don't know how to judge your heart, but I will tell you, were you capable of doing 1, 2, 3? If you're not going, if you're, it's exactly like if you were to work out. If you're not capable of doing, I guess, let's say these many push-ups, that means your core muscles are still weak. If you're not capable of doing, let's say, lifting this much weight, that means your muscles are not strong enough. So how am I going to judge whether your muscles are strong or not? I'm going to basically look into what you're capable of doing. That's how we do it. What are you capable of doing? If you're capable of doing X, Y, Z, well, that actually is a reflection that your iman had actually went this far in your heart. The nur had went this far in your heart. And that's important for us to really see that let's call it the symptom, and let's look at those areas and where, how do we evaluate our iman? We evaluate it through what type of actions are you doing? What type of environment are you putting yourself in? How much of ilm are you capable of investing? How much of focus are you capable of investing is going to give us some form of, let's say, some form of evaluation, some lens in where it's helping us see where we're at in terms of growing in our deen. So this is just one side, and of course, when we're speaking about the tafsir for these ayat, of course, we went in certain details and where what are we looking at in terms of, let's say, an assault on the tongue or an assault on somebody's body parts, and where that is and how far it went and what makes a fair punishment and all of that. Let's look at this hadith. What I wanted about this hadith is not necessarily the ruling in terms of punishment, but I want you to see a couple of things in it. Let's look at this hadith. So it was narrated in Sahih Muslim that the sister of Rubayya, Haritha, so the sister of Rubayya, Haritha, she was actually a known Sahabiya, Rubayya bint al-Nadr. She's the sister of Anas ibn al-Nadr, and he was actually a famous Sahabi. Okay, and she's the mother of Haritha ibn Suraqa. He's a guy, Sahabi, who basically had died and been killed in the day of Badr. Remember, that's actually a very important piece of information, because the Prophet ﷺ had basically said, in terms of the people of Badr, the Prophet ﷺ had mentioned that وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ, how do you know? You may not know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically might have told the people of Badr that to do whatever they may do and whatever they would do, they won't be held accountable for it. Why? Because they had participated in the Battle of Badr when the Malaika were even there. All right. Anyhow, so we look at that in where this hadith, so the sister of Rubayya, she basically had committed some harm on someone. Okay, they went to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ had ruled that there would be al-qisas. The only rule for that is al-qisas. What does that mean? Well, you committed an assault, therefore we're in response, we're going to do the same exact thing that you had done on this person. Then Rabi'a, another person. This is not here, it's a Rubayya. This woman is a Rabi'a. All right, Rabi'a said, "Oh, Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are you going to really do an equivalent, basically punishment? Wallahi, you're not going to do it." In other words, is she here necessarily saying you're not going to do it? Is she here objecting the order of the Prophet ﷺ? Or is this not necessarily an objection in where she's just hoping that this wouldn't actually happen? In other words, she is not here interceding, but she is right there. She just said, "Wallahi, you're not going to do this. Like, please don't let this happen somehow." But she said, "Wallahi, this isn't going to happen. Like, we can't harm this girl that caused this assault." It's like saying something has to be done. By Allah, we can't have this done. So the Prophet ﷺ just said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala it's in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. There's no change. We're not going to change and somehow change the ruling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because someone is objecting or they just don't want it to happen. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had ruled. And she kept on saying, by Allah, this can't happen. No. And of course, that's when she kept on saying that, but that's when, of course, the other people, remember, this is not a change into a ruling on a transgression on the limits that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had set. Okay, so this is people's rights in where they would have the right to say, we'll accept and we'll take a fair compensation. In other words, compensation in terms of money and not necessarily an assault on the person. Well, it wouldn't be considered an assault. It would actually be, let's call it a corporal punishment that is equivalent to the corporal punishment that they had caused. So that's when, of course, she kept on saying, "Wallahi, this can't happen. Wallahi, this can't happen." And that's when somehow, I guess, they were compelled, I guess, to accept idea instead of taking and insisting that they wanted the same type of harm to be inflicted upon, of course, the person that had caused the assault. So that's when the Prophet ﷺ had quote said, "Inna min ibadillah man law aqsama ala Allah la abarrah." From the servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that even if they were to make an oath on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would make it happen. Two things here. When we're looking at certainly this woman was objecting and where it wasn't an objection to the order of the Prophet ﷺ, because that would actually be kufr to object. And remember, that's completely different than when Usama ibn Zayd, when that woman that is Makhzumiyya went to the Prophet ﷺ because that Makhzumiyya woman had stolen, and then Usama ibn Zayd intercedes, goes to the Prophet ﷺ and requests that, hey, can we do something here? This is a noble woman, and we certainly don't want to apply the same ruling of basically stealing on even a noble woman. So that's when the Prophet ﷺ had comes down and basically gives his famous oration, even if the daughter of Muhammad, Fatima, had stolen, I would basically apply the ruling of stealing on her. In other words, the punishment is not going to change. We don't change the punishment. We don't change the rules because we need to somehow make it compelling to the upper class, but the rules basically are supposed to be applied on the noble and the poor in the same way. We don't change the rules. The rules are what we're supposed to be submitting to, and we don't change the rules to submit to people's likings and their interests. So this is important to keep in mind in where, how is this even different? So the scholars explained that inna min ibadillah man law aqsama ala Allah la abarrah. So this is relating to number one, in where this is relating to human rights. Yeah, human basically have the right to accept a diya, versus the story of Usama ibn Said that we said earlier. This is relating to had min hududillah. There's no shafa'ah, there's no intercession there. You cannot intercede and say, Wallahi, no, we're not going to apply this. No, if it's had min hududillah, if it's basically a ruling that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had laid out, there's no change. But in this situation, that wasn't a had min hududillah, that was a qisas. That was something in where there was an option to accept it, diya, and that's left for the people to accept or not. So she was trying to put in the pressure,
Does it say why she objected, or?
Well, certainly she objected because, hey, she's probably a young woman, probably in her early age. She didn't want her, of course, to lose her teeth. Of course, she had, I guess, pushed the lady. Who knows what she did to the other lady, but the other lady lost her tooth. So they were, well, hey, she lost her tooth, and we're going to do the same thing to you. We're basically going to make you lose your tooth. So she objected, well, no, please don't let her lose her tooth. In other words, something else can be done. Well, anyways, this is a human right. So that's where they would have the option to either say that they want the same physical punishment, or the same corporal equivalent punishment to be done on her, or they have the right to say, well, we'll accept a monetary compensation instead. So she was pushing in a way for them to accept just a monetary compensation rather than a physical assault, which to her is going to be, I guess, affecting her life, affecting her future, and perhaps her appearance. All the list goes on and on. So that's why she said, Wallahi, no, this isn't going to happen. Okay. And the Prophet ﷺ really praised her in that situation and said, from the servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in other words, from the awliya. So from the awliya is basically saying that she's at a high level of iman, in where even if they were to say wallahi, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would even let the qadar be according to what they had said, because they're mu'mineen. So does that mean we would say, Ya Allah, Wallahi, you're going to do this? No, there's a difference, okay? This isn't to say, Wallahi, Ya Allah. This isn't somehow asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, hey, you're going to do this. No, this is kufr, to think that you have the power, or that you're going to force Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do things based on what your words are saying. That's kufr, to think that your words are superior to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that you're somehow going to have the ability, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to change the qadar for you. Well, that's kufr right there. But if a person is basically making it as a form of dua, it's like, Ya Allah, Wallahi, please, I don't want this. In other words, here's a form of dua. You're making it as a form of request. It's a form of, you're making that in where you're recognizing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right there in where he has the force, has his superiority, basically determined the matters. You're here in that situation, looking at, of course, an option where it's not going against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but you're here asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, you're considering his majesty, you're considering his power, you're considering his magnificence in that situation, and you're saying, Ya Allah, by Allah, please let this happen, or by Allah, this can't happen, etc. It's not that you're objecting on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's qadar. Then in that situation, it would be permissible. And you could see here, إن من عباد الله من لو أقسم على الله لأبره, that was actually showing that it was a form of karama. What is the difference between karama and mu'jiza? Let's write it down right there. And where we've got karama, all right, let's write it down. Karama and mu'jiza. What's the difference? A mu'jiza would be a supernatural thing happening, but in where to a prophet or a messenger, and what they would do is challenge. That's the main thing, and where they would challenge others to bring the same type of a miracle in where to prove whether wrong or right. So in other words, what a miracle is supposed to be proving is the ability that this person had in changing, or at least enforcing a certain thing in nature that is not necessarily the standard that we would know in physics and biology, and in the different way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had created the world. So a miracle would be that it's an exceptional situation. It's a supernatural power that changed or eliminated or enforced a certain thing to happen that is completely different from the different laws that we would find in nature. So for example, if we're talking about a knife not slaughtering, or we're speaking about somebody, putting their hand in, like Prophet Musa alayhi salam, putting his hand in his chest or in his pocket, and it comes out with light, or even a cane changing into a snake, or etc. Those things are supernatural. There's no way that such things can actually happen. There's absolutely no way that anybody could somehow bring about some form of power to make things possible in any way. It isn't until or unless a supernatural power that has the power to change things in nature, that is capable of eliminating a certain force that was actually to happen in nature, or changing it, or even stopping it, or whatever it is. Il-karama is different. So in English, they would translate karama and mu'jiza the same way. In Arabic, no. Il-karama is something, it's a miracle. They're both miracles, but the karama is a miracle that happens to somebody that is a pious person. Okay, that's a karama. It happens to a person that's pious. Il-karama, there's no challenging to anyone to do something like it. It's a personal thing. It can be a support from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, a karama, in where Sifat al-Safwa has a lot of karamat, in where it talks about the different karamat that some salihin would actually go through. They're very interesting karamat that were talked about. Sheikh Yusuf al-Nabahani, in Syria, a lot of karamat, and really ironic, and where many were actually seen by and witnessed by a lot of salihin as well, in where somebody might have probably had the karama to know what someone is going through, and probably had a karama in where they might have had certain light happening to them, or maybe a karama, just different things. Anyways, they're exceptional situations, but no one can use these karamat in where to somehow prove that they are salihin. That's supposed to be between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And certainly if you were to get a karama, it's really important to keep it private, because if you were to announce it, you can make these karamat become areas where it could be shaitan manipulating you without you realizing, and then you depending and somehow thinking of yourself as salih, and then feeling that, okay, I'm all done. I'd actually reached the level of faith to the point that I'm getting miracles right now. I'm all done. And without you realizing, you could be actually putting yourself on the path of right now regressing in your faith, regressing in your application, because you would think that you had reached the level of yaqeen. Okay, so that's the difference between karama and mu'jiza. So is this a form of karama? Well, certainly part of the karamat, in where she had said, wallahi, this isn't going to happen, but then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically, let's say, let what she had made the dua for not to happen, which is, well, let me say it this way. What she had made the dua for to happen, not to happen, because what she didn't want to happen was that the girl would lose her tooth, or the woman would lose her tooth. And she didn't want that to happen. And that's basically what she insisted on. Okay, let's continue. And there is another story. I want you to look at this one, in where this story in Sahih Muslim was basically giving different names than the story that was narrated in Sunan al-Nasa'i, in where Nasa'i basically said a similar story, but put in different names. So certainly what was at least within, it could be right there, it could be that there were two different incidents, and it could be that it was just a confusion in really who were the different people that had made the dua or made the request, or etc., and that the Prophet ﷺ had said the same exact quote twice. So I just want you to look at this one, where you can have different narrations that may give a quote that the Prophet ﷺ had said something, and that's probably the main theme that they were focused on, in where inna min ibadillah man law aqsama ala Allahi la abarra. It could be the same exact quote said in multiple incidents, and it could be that the same exact quote, of course, it was focused at the quote as actually authentic, but then the details in where what exactly was the incident, in where sometimes you could see different reports on what exactly was the incident. All right, so the scholars had unanimously agreed that if there was an assault on somebody's tooth, and of course there's a difference between an assault that was intended. In other words, it was an intentional assault. It was basically something that they had prepared for. It was purposely done. In between someone that didn't necessarily do it on purpose, they were walking, tripped on something, and then they fell. I remember one time going down the stairs, and somehow my classmates, somehow they wanted me to trip, and they stepped on my jilbab, the long hijab, the abaya kind of, and they were wanting me to fall off the stairs. But subhanAllah, they stepped on it. I kept going, but then I see all of them going boom right in front of me. They were 4 girls, and they ended up all falling and tripping. And I was really confused. I'm the only one that was saved, and they all tripped. It was, a girl's thing. It wasn't, I'm not considering this as a karama, okay? It was just a young girls thing, teenagers that, sometimes they think it's funny, but they ended up actually falling. But anyhow, let's just assume, okay, I tripped. Okay, let's assume that I tripped and broke my teeth, or broke a tooth. Are we going to break all the girls' teeth, or what are we going to do? Okay, so in that situation, of course, as an example, okay, they didn't necessarily mean to break anybody's teeth. They were just playing. They were just, being silly, and they didn't really think it would go that far. Okay, so in that situation, this wouldn't be intended that it would go that far. Okay, there's a difference between, no, I'm actually intending to break that person's leg or to harm that person in a specific way. Then in that situation, we would basically apply al-qawad or al-qasas. We would basically go for giving the same equivalent harm that was intended, that they had put in, and basically make that as a fair trial and a fair punishment on them.
I have a question. So would that be for if somebody they reach puberty, right? Or would that?
Well, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay.
This
Just
wouldn't be
sure.
no, Noura, of course. For children, never are the children trialed like adults. Children are going to be children. Okay, so we don't have a juvenile system in Islam. We wouldn't necessarily put children unless they were talking about, let's say, for example, 10-year-olds and 11-year-olds, they're aware of what they're doing, then in that situation, we definitely need to set a system to figure out what's making these children act in such an evil way. We then have to figure out how to correct this, not necessarily in probably applying the same rules of hudud, and certainly, or of punishment, al-qasas, because in that situation, of course, we can't apply any corporal punishment on children because anyways, they're not held accountable. But we will have to create a system that undermines, or let's say that figures out and makes sure that such crimes are not happening, and what's actually causing these children to somehow, from being innocent to somehow being cruel and commit such crimes. So then we would have to, figure out those different systems, and not necessarily to the level of punishing them the same way that we would punish an adult. Absolutely not. Okay, let's continue right there. So when we're speaking about of course, al-qisas, in other words, equivalent punishment. They had differences of opinions if we're talking about, let's say, fractures, or whether we're speaking about different levels of fracturing the bones, and what would be a fair punishment for that. And of course, they did actually look at this one. This is extremely important. So the fracturing for, let's say, a bone in where, let's say, an arm, or fracturing an arm is completely different than actually fracturing, those longer bones, or let's say we're talking about fracturing perhaps chest bones. So those areas are completely different, in where if they're in the core, their main bones, it wouldn't necessarily be making sense in where we're going to be fracturing an equivalent bone, because in that situation, are we really creating more disabilities here than what was really intended, what was really happening, and all of that? So, and there's a difference between, and we're talking about perhaps dislocating a certain bone, or perhaps maybe a fracture that went farther than just a simple cut. And we're not talking about a simple cut, but the different fractures, in where one fracture might have actually gone farther than just cutting a straight cut. And it's really hard to say, well, how much of a cut are we going to be doing? Of course, the x-ray can show you, let's say, multiple fractures, and can show that no, there was even more than a straight cut, in where no, it's actually little pieces and all of that. So in that situation, you're seeing the differences of opinions. I'm not going to go into all of those differences of opinions, because number one, in where it was more of a comprehensive note in the area, and then the scholars, in the light of that, in the light as well of what makes a fair compensation, that's where they had these differences of opinions, but not necessarily, I would say, going back to a text, but it's more of what they would think would make a fair judgment in that regard. But they would definitely take it in consideration on what would make a fair trial. So of course, I'm not going to go into that, because it's it's important to keep in mind, in where when we apply this ayah, فَمَنْ اعْتَدَى عَلَيْكُمْ فَاعْتَدُوا عَلَيْهِ بِمِثْلِ مَا اعْتَدَى عَلَيْكُمْ. So the general comprehensive rule, in where whoever commits an assault on you, then you have the right to, basically, in response to whatever assault that happened onto you, have the right to get an equal, let's say, punishment in the same way that they had harmed you in. And of course, the ayah says, وَإِنْ عَاقَبْتُمْ فَعَاقِبُوا مِثْلِ مَا عُوقِبْتُمْ بِهِ. And if you would basically get harmed, okay, you would harm and inflict, you have the right to inflict harm in the same level, etc. So do we necessarily take that comprehensiveness? You would say in where أجمعوا عليه, and where they had unanimously agreed that all of those different assaults are basically coming in. And here's the question where Noura's asking, well, is this necessarily to be a public trial or is this to be a personal one? So this basically, when we're speaking about al-qasas, it doesn't have to be public like the way we would do hudud. Okay, so those are more of let's say community, and where this is relating to the person and not necessarily relating to the whole public. In other words, the assault that is relating to the public, and where we're talking about zina. Okay, and we're talking about zina, and we had 4 witnesses. Well, this person, when they had 4 witnesses witness all of this, you didn't make it private. You actually had made it very public to the point that there are 4 people to witness this. Zina is an assault, or let's call it a transgression on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's principles. But when we're talking about a personal assault would be, no, it's they're the ones that need to see that their rights were protected. Okay, that their rights were protected. So that's a different story. And we're just keeping that one in mind. I'm not going to go into those details, just letting you know of how far and how we look at ta'zir, and how the scholars of fiqh had sometimes done their own evaluation. They had done their own, let's say, research in what makes a fair thing, even if we don't really have a text. So then they would go in where, well, how far did that fracture go? How much of a pain did it cause on all those different areas? And where, even if we're talking about, let's say, a person committing an assault on somebody's head, did that cause some form of, let's say, a skin laceration? Did it go farther, and where it probably showed the bones? Did it go farther and probably cause a certain fracture? Did the fracture cause some form of a deep fracture into the brain? How far did it go? And are we talking about a small cut, or how big is it? Did it go into, no, it didn't just cause a small cut or a fracture, but no, it actually went deeper inside the brain, or inside the skull, and how far did it go, and what did it really do? And it's not necessarily about the bleeding, because certainly the bleeding in the head is not like the bleeding that you would actually get in different areas. All right, and so just keeping that one in mind, I'm not going to go into all those details. You could see where they would talk about the different harms that some might cause onto the skull and all of that. And, I'm just letting you know, we're going to skip all of that. I'm just going to skip all of that. Look at that here. They're talking about, I was wanting to speak about all these points, but then I felt that, it's going to be, it's going to be too much in details, and at the end, it's going to be forgotten. So, and it doesn't really depend on necessarily the evidences as much as it's hukuma. Remember that word hukuma, where it's scholars' evaluation, the judge's evaluation to the situation, and therefore it's determined by them. So what about the assault on different extremities? Okay, so in that situation, we're talking about that there's a difference between the extremities and where the hands, and perhaps a difference between what is in here al-makhuf or is it al-mujawwaf. Okay, what is al-mujawwaf? There's a difference between the extremities, and we're talking about a hand, and probably when we're speaking about the bones relating to perhaps the rib bones, those are completely different. The assault on a rib bone is perhaps, let's call it more sensitive. There are certain sensitive areas in where, when you're speaking about certain bones, they're going to be more sensitive than other bones. So if we're talking about a hand, it's completely different than if we're talking about perhaps a spine. All right, the spine is completely different. A spine and a fracture in a spine can actually be extremely dangerous, can lead to paralysis, can lead to so many different things. It's not even comparable. An assault on a spine can be extremely hard. And where do we really want to do the same type of the punishment on the person's spine for probably breaking someone else's spine? And of course, it might not even be easy to cause such an assault or to inflict, let's say, the same amount of pain or the same amount of assault, because it can go wrong. Okay, we definitely don't want to cause more harm than the harm that they had caused. So in that situation, if we're looking at certain assaults, before we jump and say, okay, that's it, we're going to cause the same assault, we're going to make your back the same way, we're going to say, wait a minute, we don't use that general but that general default ruling, and where al-juruh qisas, and where we're going to say, okay, any harm on the body, we're going to do the same thing. No, we're going to be considering that there are certain, let's say, bones, there are certain organs, there are certain areas that we're not going to say we're going to do the same thing. So there's a difference between talking about extremities and between talking about certain bones that are, let's call it, in more sensitive areas. So just keep that one in mind, in where look at this one, even neck bones, or probably talking about certainly the spine or chest bones, or perhaps talking about the long bones in the thighs. We're looking at really sensitive areas where the pain, and it can really go wrong. So we don't necessarily say, okay, well, here's the default ruling, we're just going to apply it. No, we're looking at the aftermath and how this might actually go wrong, and making sure that, no, we can bring about a fair trial without probably causing worse and probably going farther. Let's see this one, when we're talking about perhaps somebody harming someone's head, or probably a cut in the skin. And in that situation, if it doesn't really reach, and here's in mudiha, in where we're talking about of course, the assault going far, and where if it doesn't get to the bone, and in that situation, they had differences of opinions on what actually makes a fair compensation for such an assault. And where are we talking about whether we're speaking about perhaps causing an incision, or perhaps just a laceration, or perhaps a bleeding, or probably a couple stitches, or perhaps some form of, no, it went farther, and where even when we're speaking about cuts, there's a first degree, second degree cut, and of course the farther you go into the skin, then you're leaving a scar. And how far is the scar, how far is the cut, the bruise, and all of that, that's going to be taken within hukuma. That's going to be taken consideration by the scholars. And sometimes they will go in differences of opinions on what actually makes a fair, let's call it, monetary compensation. Does it go all to the level of probably of giving khamsun min al-ibl, in where it's equivalent to the price of 5 camels? And remember, at the time, when we're speaking about camels and all of that, we're speaking about, at the time, it was considered their currency. So that's why they would talk about camels. So we're not going to be necessarily saying, well, yeah, we're going to be giving camels. So we talked about that one. All right. So they basically had, of course, agreed on certain assaults, and where if it were to happen on the head or the face, on what actually makes a fair judgment in there. But then they went into differences of opinions if we're talking about, for example, a cut that reaches the bone, or dislocation in the head, or, well, not dislocation in the head, but a dislocation in different parts in the body. Because if you're dislocating a bone in the head, there are only a couple bones in the head anywhere in the skull, but we're talking about dislocation in certain things. If it basically goes as reaching the brain, what that would actually mean in terms of an assault. Okay, and I'm not gonna go in. I'm gonna skip all of that. See, we're really skipping. Okay, and let's go. Even though there are so many beautiful things, I really love reading this. You could see I'm just oh dear, I'm going over a lot of what I had already highlighted. Well, that's because I enjoy reading it, but not many people are really keeping track of what we're actually doing in terms of learning about, I guess, these types of assault. Let's see right there. What if a person somehow hit another person with assault? What is assault? Basically, let's say they perhaps got a stick, or perhaps used, I don't know, a wire to hit another person. Are we going to use the same thing, or are we going to increase let's say the assault that they had committed? Now that's the differences of opinions. Why? Let's say a person hit another person, let's just assume 15 times. Are you really, when the person hit the other person, he said 15 times, did they really count? And when a person's angry, they just continue hitting, they don't really count. Okay. Are we really going to be just making 15 for 15 times that you had hit, or are we going to increase because there was some form of an assault? So we're not just going to do the equivalent amount. No, we're adding because you had committed a deliberate assault. In other words, you didn't just harm, but you intended to cause an assault. That's where is Shafi'i. This one's really rather interesting. And Shafi'i considered that, no, we're going to look into the situation. And by looking into the situation, that's when the Qadi would basically give about and give what would make a fair trial, in where, yes, even though the person literally counted 15 times of probably attacking the other person, but then the Shafi'i said, well, in that situation, it doesn't have to be 15. We would let the Qadi determine on whether it's going to be 20, 25, 30, or what the equal punishment is going to be, because it could be that it's a child, it could be that it was hey, it was a deliberate humiliation that it was done in, etc. Then in that situation, we would say in where fihi hukuma. So it doesn't have to be, not everything has to be just equal. Sometimes we can take in consideration the circumstances that surrounded the assault and what would make a fair zawajir. What is zawajir? Zawajir, and where let others know that there is a powerful law enforcement, in where you can't just consider that you can trespass people's rights and think that you can get away with it. All right, so here we go, and where just trying to go as in where, let's see, look at this one. أقاد عمر من ضربة بالدرة. What is that? This is kind of weird, in where Umar ibn al-Khattab had his own stick, and he even gave it a name. It was called the Durra. It's kind of weird. Yeah, he even gave it a name. It was called the Durra. And And whenever he would see something that is gone wrong, sometimes he will use a durra, which basically is his stick, to basically hit and correct with it. The one that really stands out in where a man comes in, and I always, I always keep this one in mind, okay? So it was commonly known that there's this guy that was, I guess, spreading misconceptions within the Muslim community. So what was the misconception? Well, he was, hey, وَالذَّارِيَاتِ ذَرْوًا, what is that supposed to mean? And he was making his own interpretation even for the Quran. So Umar ibn al-Khattab brings this guy. He's like, oh, what is your question again? And he said, well, this is my question. So Umar al-Khattab, okay, well, you don't intend to question, you just intend to create misconceptions. So he gets a durra, and here it is. Gives him a couple good, good durra spanks. And then later on, brings him over and he said, so what is your question again? These are my questions. Bang, gives it to him again. Then says, brings him up again the third time. He says, what is your question again? And then he basically said, that's it. I've learned my lesson. I don't have any of these questions. In other words, it wasn't necessarily wanting to inquire. It was wanting to bring about misconceptions and confusions, and wanting to create some form of, I guess, confusion within the society. It isn't until after the death of Umar ibn al-Khattab that the Khawarij, they wanted to somehow use this man to continue his I guess, spreading of these confusions. So they bring this man again and say, hey, remember the questions, remember the things that you were right there spreading within the society. Remember Umar ibn al-Khattab? Well, he's dead right now. Now is your time to start, hey, bringing and spreading these kinds of confusions again. And he said, "Addabani al-abdu salih." He said, "Al-abdu salih, that pious man, had disciplined me. I'm never going to do this again." You could see Durra really comes in handy, and definitely taught him a lesson, even when Sahib al-Durra, Umar ibn al-Khattab, had died. All right, you could see in where Ali ibn Abi Talib also had, of course, ثلاثة أصوات, in where he basically did same thing, in where sometimes to use some form of course, let's say, call it corporal punishment at least. اقتص شريح من صوت وخموش. Who's Shuraih? Shuraih, many people think Shuraih al-Qadi is a Sahabi. He actually isn't. He was a Tabi'i. He never met the Prophet ﷺ. He became Muslim, and later, of course, became Muslim during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. He was in Yemen, didn't get the chance to meet the Prophet ﷺ, and later on, of course, met a lot of Sahaba. Umar ibn al-Khattab assigned him to be the Qadi because of his one, his justice. Two, did not fear to say the truth, no matter who was basically in front of him, didn't fear to say what the truth was. And three, he had great experience in ruling, in knowing people's situations and how they managed to manipulate. So Shuraih al-Qadi was actually famous for being a person that was bringing in a lot of justice. And he actually lived pretty long. It was said that he lived until the age of 180. Allahu Alam if that was true. Remember, sometimes these dates that would be put forward, you want to keep in mind that, number one, I mean, we don't have any, let's say, government that was keeping track of people's birth certificates. So some of those numbers are definitely exaggerated, or at least some of those numbers were definitely, let's say, not accurate, because we don't really have any records of this. It was mentioned that he lived long. That's the most that we could say. Could he have lived that long? I mean, who knows how healthy he was, and who knows whether that is possible at the end of the day. We just know that he lived long, and he didn't go into any type of dementia, didn't go through any of those, I guess, illnesses of age, related illnesses and all of that, and Parkinson's and all of that. But at the end, we just know al-Qadi Shuraih, Umar ibn Khattab even assigned him to be a Qadi in al-Kufa for a pretty long time. 60 years, he was a Qadi for 60 years. So if he was a Qadi for 60 years, and when he was Muslim already, around 50 or 60, so that's why they had said that he lived for 180, because he was already old. And then later, well, they kept track of how many years he was a Qadi for. So that's as long as they could remember. At the end of the day, how old, we don't really know, but it was mentioned that it was pretty for a pretty long time. All right, Ibn Battal had said there is وحديث لد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لأهل البيت حجة لمن جعل القود في كل ألم وإن لم يكن جرح. So here the Prophet ﷺ, of course, had right there in where the Prophet ﷺ definitely the Prophet ﷺ had, what was the story, and where the Prophet ﷺ basically got ill. And the Prophet ﷺ had ordered them while he was ill, all right, not to put in and force him to drink a medication that he didn't want. But they basically, of course, the family that was around him, the Prophet was telling them not to insert this medication in his mouth, but then they inserted that medication by force, because they thought that the Prophet ﷺ was refusing the medication because he wasn't focused or aware of the situation that he was in. So they were considered as it was a form of hallucination when he was telling them not to put the medication and not to force them to drink the medication. So here the Prophet ﷺ later, because they had objected and they had rejected the order of the Prophet ﷺ, that's when the Prophet ﷺ had basically punished those that did not take the Prophet ﷺ's orders, even though the Prophet ﷺ had given them the order and made it clear that they shouldn't be enforcing or at least inducing such medication in his mouth. Okay. And certainly, that punishment, was it a punishment because they had inserted the medication or induced the medication that he didn't want? Or is it an assault on the Prophet ﷺ? At the end, in where they definitely did cause an assault, and of course, in where some scholars look at that, Ibn Battal, basically a Maliki scholar, great Maliki scholar, he even has Sharh on Sahih al-Bukhari. He said, well, this actually proves whether we're speaking about a small assault inducing someone to drink a medication that they don't want, or whether we're speaking about, let's say, a worse assault. We're talking about perhaps maybe a cut, a laceration, a bruise, a black eye, whatever it is, that at the end, that there is supposed to be a fair judgment in where the person has the right to seek compensation for that assault. So this is just in general, just to keep that in mind. So it doesn't mean that if somebody went through some assault and we're going to say, well, how bad is it? Really? Are you really going to ask for a fair trial on a slap? Yes. Even if it's a slap, the person has the right to get a fair trial, whether we're speaking about a slap or whether we're speaking about inducing a medication or somehow causing pain on anybody at the end. To somehow transgress the limits on anybody is not to be acceptable. To basically consider people's rights is the default ruling. To somehow transgress the limit, the person has the right to seek a fair compensation. And I'm going to stop right there because inshallah tomorrow we're going to talk about in terms of what if what if the assault was on a woman, are we going to do the same type of, let's say, qasas? Are we going to do the same type of dia? What are we looking at right there? So we're going to talk a little bit about this, but alhamdulillah, we're actually almost done. Let's look really quick where we're at right now. We only have 2 different issues. We're then done with that ayah, and then we're going to go and move on to the other ayat. Let's look at those other ayat and kind of get an overview of what we're doing.
Can I
وقفينا
ask
على
a
أثرهم
question? Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Noura.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask you, if the occurrence that you were talking about, the last situation where the Prophet ﷺ, he ordered them not to just give him the medication, um, was that had to do with somebody's will, like yani if they're in like hospice care or something like that?
Right.
Or is that just, sorry.
So fair enough. The scholars actually had differences of opinions. That's a very, very good question, Noura. The scholars actually had differences of opinions on when the Prophet ﷺ had basically punished them for giving him their medication when he had requested not to. Was that punishment because they had transgressed on a prophet, or was that considered a transgression on him as a human being, basically, where I didn't give consent and you still gave me that medication when I didn't give consent? A couple of things to say here. Number one, when we're giving medication to a person, it's important to keep in mind to medicate someone and to take the medication is not obligatory. Even though, just keep in mind, scholars had differences of opinions on whether you are supposed to seek treatment or not. I did write that whole, whole research and the different debates between scholars and what they had said in that regards, in that the hospice care and Islamic rulings in that regard. So you can look into that. But in general, are we obligated to seek treatment? The answer is there are differences of opinions between scholars on whether we have to seek treatment or not. Okay. Now, do we medicate a person against their will? Let's say we're talking about mental illnesses, and we're probably putting a pill inside their juice, not letting them know, or probably giving them morphine to make their pain go away. And we know that that morphine is going to not only take away their sense of pain, but it's probably going to even make them start going into some form of hallucinations or some form they're not fully awake in what they're doing. Okay, so in that situation, it's important to respect, even if we're speaking about somebody in where probably hospice care or whatever situation that they're in, it's important. The preponderant is that it's important to respect the person's choice on whether they want to go through pain, whether they want to choose sabr over that, or whether they want to seek treatment, or even when we're speaking about different medications, especially if we're talking about pain medications. Of course, when it was mentioned in the final report by the doctors that they don't necessarily have a treatment for this illness, and all that is left is really just to use Dilaudid and pain medications and all these morphines and all these, pain medications to really help with pain and pain management is all that's left. In where, how far can we actually use such pain medications for? And let's say that the pain medications weren't really working. Okay, even those pain medications, they're giving them, let's say, Dilaudid every 4 hours, but even that medication or that painkiller is not working and all those different things. And but the person tried before using something perhaps like marijuana. And that was the only thing that was helping them uh, go through such pain. Is it permissible to use such types of um, such types of I guess plants and herbs and or even let's say street drugs? Is it permissible to use such types of street drugs? Now that two things. Number one, in where if it's within the area in where there's no other thing that's working except that, then the first opinion is that it's permissible to use. The second opinion, they said, no, it's never going to be permissible to use. We're not talking, well, I guess marijuana is a little different, but let's say we're talking about something even stronger than marijuana, like cocaine. Okay. And of course, we know that there are differences between certain street drugs and where how the one how potent they are, and when we're talking about how strong they are, and what influence and what impact does it have. If it's taking away the person's ability to focus, the person's ability to completely be aware, or is it only having one effect? Is the effect only to take away the person's ability to focus, or is it also having multiple influences in where it could also remove the pain? And what are we talking about? If the impact on that person is nothing but 100% harm, even if it may seem that it's bringing us some form of healing, then that would be haram to use. That's a preponderance, would be haram to use. But if it's a dual thing, and where, yes, it is bringing in some level of harm, but it's also bringing in some level of treatment, or not necessarily treatment, but let's say some level of endurance for the pain, like marijuana, for example, or probably what right now uh, that uh, those different, of course, things that they would smoke, or different things that they might actually, what is it, THC, was it called? I forgot what it was called, but anyhow, those different weeds and all of that, then in that situation, even though not recommended, but if that's the only thing that's working in keeping us an amount of awareness, then if that's the only thing that's working, it is permissible to use, and to avoid it, is best. May Allah, Ya Rabbi, Ya Allah, it's so easy to talk about this when you're not going through pain. But when you're going through the pain and it becomes more than what you can handle, in where it's, the amount of pain can sometimes be so excruciating to the point that a person can actually lose their ability to even think. And Ya Allah, subhanAllah, I remember how my uncle was going through glioblastoma, and I could, and I just never forget about the pain that he was going through, and where he was a very sharp-minded person, very smart, very aware of what was going around him, and nothing is basically to skip his attention. But then, subhanAllah, when he went through such excruciating pain, even morphine was not even helping. And even all those different pain medications, he was taking them, and they were not helping. And I would say, what is the pain level? He would be like, it's beyond what you can imagine. It's beyond any pain that anyone can imagine. And subhanAllah, it was making him, go through
Sounds
these
like a childbirth.
it seems like, I would say, probably worse, Noura, because
Oh,
even when we're talking about labor, I mean, I've went through C-section, I've went through natural delivery. I was still capable of knowing what's happening around me. You know, we're capable of knowing whether they're doing, a stitching, or that doctor is basically saying, get the oxygen, hey, push, and whatever they're telling you. Oh, we were capable. I was capable of knowing what was going on. I mean, we didn't lose our ability to focus. But when you're talking about excruciating pain, that's where the person's not even capable of being aware of what's going on around them. The pain is so
They
is so
pass out, you're saying.
pass out, literally pass out.
Ya Allah.
Then we're speaking about something that is, I guess I know that, our the sensory of pain differs from one person to another, and how much we're capable of handling pain. It differs even in one part of the body, and where even your body, you're probably getting and sensing pain in one side of the body more than the other side, and one person might sense pain more than the other person, even though it could be the same amount of pinch or whatever. But at the end of the day, how much they're capable of handling, and whether they want to continue getting medicated or not, that's something that is left for them on what choices they want to do. And we don't necessarily have to medicate somebody against their will. That's what I'm trying to get to. Don't medicate somebody against their will is, wallahu alam, the preponderant. With mental illness, I guess the situation is quite different, because with mental illness, is the person even having a will? Can we consider that what they are choosing to will is that's their will, when anyways this person is completely unaware of what's happening to them? So do we make the will on their behalf, or do we let them make a will? Well, how is it that they're going to be making a will when they can't even differentiate between what is real and what is not real? The
Yeah,
voices
that's true. For
that
making decisions.
right. How can we consider that their decisions are sound decisions when they're actually ill in their own mind? You understand what I'm saying? It's completely different than when we're talking about somebody, that is probably going through maybe stage 4 cancer, they're dying, but they're capable of knowing what they want. They're capable of understanding the consequence. They're capable of recognizing what the situation is looking like, what their options are, and what they really want. Okay. But if it's a mental illness, this person is not even understanding. They don't even consider themselves. They're willing to consider all the people in this whole world as mentally ill, and they'll refuse. They will refuse, and they will accuse everybody of being insane but themselves. They will swear that no, there's a conspiracy. You're all trying to harm me. I know what I'm saying. You're all mentally ill, but I'm not. That's what they will say. They will swear by, by the Quran. They will swear by anything. And that's really, that's a really tricky area, and where, whose will do we consider? And yeah, I hope, I'm just trying to put you within the area of what scholars had basically considered, and how do we understand all of this, and do we medicate someone against their own will? And is it something that we really have to medicate? Do we not medicate? Is it best not to medicate?
It could happen to anybody where they have their
Ya Rabbi.
parents,
Yep.
and
Or-
might have to choose or what to do.
Yep. الله المستعان الله المستعان يا ربي. ما الله سبحانه وتعالى يا ربي. اللهم متعنا بأسماعنا وتمتعنا بقوتنا، متعنا بأبصارنا أبدا ما أبقيتنا، واجعله الوارث منا. This is very important to make the dua. يعني to do this dua, يا الله متعنا with our قوة, with our سمع, with our بصر. Give us forever and as long as we live our health, our ability to hear, our ability to see, our ability and our health to be as long as we live. Allahumma ameen. Allahumma ameen. Allahumma ameen. Illness is no fun. I was hospitalized for a couple of times, and I think, Ya Rabbi, that's the last thing I want. Ya Rabbi, Ya Rabbi, Ya Rabbi. May Allah subhanahu wa
Yeah,
ta'ala.
my grandma, she had dementia, so
Ya
she
Rabbi.
didn't know like what
Yep.
she didn't know what was going on. SubhanAllah.
You know, palliative care, I think, is the hardest field, to be honest, because when you're talking about,
Yeah.
it's the hardest field because although, yes, it's palliative care, but you know that you're not treating the person. You're just making their death really be as peaceful as possible. That is so hard, where you know this person in 6 months, in a year, they're not going to be there. You're just really seeing one person after another die right before your eyes.
SubhanAllah.
Ya Rabbi, Ya Rabbi, Ya Rabbi, Ya Rabbi. You know,
There's actually a sister who is a student of Gems of Light, and she actually develops the curriculum for the
palliative
palliative
care.
care.
Oh, Ya Rabbi.
Yeah.
يا ربي سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نستغفرك ونتوب إليك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت. Um, this is it. Inshallah, we'll see you all tomorrow. And hey, we're getting really close. And look, Alhamdulillah, we're growing in our tafsir. Alhamdulillah.
Oh yeah, what was the first today?
What was the first? Well, we were doing, we were going over, I guess, the different types of evidences, because we're talking about whether we basically have references for the different rulings in terms of those rulings and whether we
So
have references
45,
for it.
Yani?
Yeah. So today we were still on 45.
Okay.
And we also talked about not only the references, we also talked about, of course, قول الصحابي, المرفوع, الموقوف. We also went through different types of assaults. How do we understand the measurement of it? And I guess uh, the ruling, and how do we understand what makes a failed trial? And we went
Okay.
through some of those things, but we're still not done. And then we went for hadith the Ukht al-Rubayya, the hadith in where the Prophet ﷺ had basically said that إن من عباد الله من لو أقسم على الله لأبره, from the servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if they were to basically make an oath, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would implement it for them. We went in details in that regards, and we went in details about the difference between miracles and also al-karama and al-mu'jiza. And of course, we went into then medications and the different types of medications and where can we induce and basically force somebody to drink a medication. And we went into when the Prophet ﷺ was forced forced to drink a certain medication, and then of course they basically went against the Prophet ﷺ's will, and when the Prophet ﷺ basically was aware and where the Prophet ﷺ ludda غير العباس, so everyone was basically uh, uh, basically punished for inducing a medication that the Prophet ﷺ did not consent for. Okay, so this is it. Inshallah,
A
subhanakallah.
little roller coaster.
Yeah, exactly. Roller coaster, but that's what I like
But
about
we
tafsir.
get there. That's the point.
There we go. We're good there, you know, learning about Islam and different things and going left and right and taking a little piece of it. Let's look at this hadith. من حديث عائشة رضي الله عنها لددنا النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم في مرضه فقال فقال لا تلدوني فقلنا كراهية المريض للدواء فلما أفاق قال لا يبقى أحد منكم إلا لد غير العباس فإنه لم يشهدكم. So what happened? Basically, Sayyidah Aisha said we basically induced the medication when the Prophet ﷺ was ill. And the Prophet ﷺ said, don't induce the medication. So they said, oh, it's probably just the ill person just hating the medication. So when the Prophet ﷺ was basically healed, the Prophet ﷺ basically said, لا يبقى أحد منكم إلا لد. You're all going to get some of that same medication, basically, except Al-Abbas because he wasn't there. Okay. And yeah, so here we go. This is basically it. So they were punished for it. And
By
here,
drinking disgusting medication.
by drinking disgusting medication. Okay. And, you know, subhanAllah, Huh. Yeah. All right. This is it. Inshallah, we'll continue tomorrow. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.